Hi, we're going to take our last lesson and we're going to add on to it. So this time you notice we're going to have more than one fraction. We're going to have 2 or 3 fractions, and we're going to have an operation in between it. And the operation we're going to work on in this lesson is either going to be multiplication or division. Our first couple examples we're going to start out with is going to be multiplication. Okay. And with multiplication, we're just going to do the same thing we were doing with one fraction. We're going to start out with all the fractions, and we're just going to look for a GCF, and then we're going to look for factoring and do that for the top and bottom of every fraction. So the first one, I noticed the top fraction has a GCF, so I would take out a 3. Oops, I have a weird mark over here. Let's get rid of that. Okay, so if I take out a 3, if I divide each one, then I'm left with x plus 1. Then go to the bottom of that fraction, and I notice it also has a GCF, and the largest thing that goes into that is 6. And then if I divide each one by 6, then that would leave me with x plus 2 times, go to the second fraction. On the top, this one also has a GCF, and the largest one that goes in there is 6. So that will give me 6 parentheses x plus 1. And on the bottom is 18. 18 is just one term. We can't do anything with one term, so we're going to leave that alone. Now, just like one fraction, you can cancel up and down on each fraction. So you could cancel up and down each fraction. Or here's a new thing. With multiplying, you can also cancel diagonally. So you can go top, bottom, diagonal, and you can also go top, bottom, diagonal the other way. What you are not allowed to do, which is why I set up this problem, is, do you notice I have an x plus 1 on the top of this fraction and an x plus 1 on the top of this fraction? You are not allowed to go sideways. You cannot cancel anything out sideways. It has to be a top and bottom. So you can go top and bottom up and down, or you can go top and bottom diagonally. But you are not allowed to cancel anything sideways. Okay, so eventually we'll get to canceling. But just like before, we need to make sure we list our restrictions first. And you must list the restrictions for both fractions on the denominators. So if I look at the first fraction, I have an x plus 2. So to make that equal 0, I would say that would be negative 2. The second fraction, 18 doesn't have a variable with it, so that one doesn't have any x's on the bottom, so I can't list a restriction for that one. Okay, now we can get into the canceling. So here, I'm going to go ahead and say, just so we can practice the new way, let's practice going diagonal. So if I was to look this direction right here, you should notice that I have a 6 on top and bottom. So I can say this 6 and this 6 go away. And then if I look diagonal the other direction, I have a 3 and 18. Well, I know a 3 and 18 are both divisible by 3. So this 3 would go away. It would turn into a 1, because 3 divided by 3 is 1. And then 18 divided by 3 becomes a 6. And then I can't do anything with the parentheses, because remember, you can't cancel any parentheses up or down because they're not identical. And I can't cancel any parentheses diagonal. Now our goal is to go from 2 separate fractions into putting our two fractions together to make one fraction for our final answer. So when I'm putting the two tops together, I don't really have to write this 1 out here. So on the tops, I just have an x plus 1 and an x plus 1. So x plus 1, x plus 1. So I'm going to put those together to make one big fraction. On the bottom, I have a parentheses x plus 2 and a plain number 6. Okay, you should always write your plain number or information that is not in a parentheses first, and then you should start listing your parentheses second. So on the bottom, it should look like 6 parentheses x plus 2. And then you have your restriction off to the side with it, and you are done. Okay, let's try some more. Okay, on the next one, on the first fraction, it does not have a GCF, so I got to do some kind of factoring, and it doesn't start with a 1x squared, so this one we're going to have to do long factoring. So I'm going to make an x, so 6 times 4 is 24, and the bottom is negative 11. So what multiplies for a positive 24, that adds for negative 11. Well, that would be negative 8 and negative 3. So then I'm going to make a box. So 6x squared minus 8x minus 3x and 4. Okay, 6 and 3 are both divisible by 3. They each have an x. Switch over to multiplying. So this would have to be 2x, then negative 4, and then negative 1. Okay, so then on the first fraction, we're looking at 3x minus 4 and 2x minus 1. On the bottom, we just have 3x. There's no plus or minus there, so that's just considered one term, so I'm just going to leave that alone. Okay, let's go to the second fraction. The second fraction, I noticed that this one is missing the c, and remember in the last lesson we talked about if you were missing the c, it always has a GCF. So if you look, you'll be like, oh, it has a GCF. It has a 2 and an x, so let's take out a 2x. So if I take out a 2x, then I'm left with x plus 2. Okay, on the bottom, it does not have a GCF, and it doesn't start with a 1x squared, so we're going to have to do long factoring again. So 3 times negative 8 is negative 24. The bottom is 2. So multiplies for negative 24, that adds for 2 is 6 and negative 4. So now I'm going to make myself a box. So 3x squared, 6x, negative 4x, and negative 8. 3 and 4 don't have a number in common, but they both have an x. So then I'm going to switch to multiplying. So that would be 3x, and then 2, and then negative 4. So we're looking at x plus 2 and 3x minus 4. Okay, so let's go make our restrictions. So for our restrictions, the first fraction, we have just a 3x. Okay, if you have an x that's not in a parentheses, then its restriction is always going to be a 0. Then the second fraction on the bottom, that one would be -2. And then this parentheses, you switch the sign and divide. So you're looking at +4/3. Let me write that again, didn't look very good. Okay, so now let's go see what we can cancel. Okay, and if I look diagonally, I notice I have a 3x minus 4. If I look up and down on the second fraction, I have an x plus 2 and an x plus 2. And then if I look at something that's not in the parentheses diagonally, I have this x and this x. And remember, we're allowed to cancel those x's because there is no plus or minus next to them, behind them. So remember, we're allowed to cancel part of it. So then what do we have on top? I have the plane number 2. And then I have 2x minus 1. On the bottom, I have a plane number 3. And it looks like that's it. And then I put that with my restriction, and I'm done. Okay, so now we need to talk about division, because division has a few different things that's going to happen. Don't know if you remember division back when you were younger, but for division you have to change division to multiplication. And in order to do that, maybe you remember the saying keep, change, flip. So what we're going to do is we're going to keep the first fraction the same, and then we're going to change division to multiplication, and we're going to flip the second fraction over. So the first fraction, we're going to keep it, so then we're just going to do the normal GCF factoring for that one. So if I look at this one, I notice it has a missing C term. So if you're missing the C term, remember that's a GCF. So this one I say, oh look, it has a 2 and an x. So take out a 2x. And then you're left with x minus 5. On the bottom, that one is difference of squares, and difference of squares you will automatically factor into 2 parentheses. So you're going to have x plus x minus, and then what multiplies for 25, that's the same number, and that will be 5 and 5. Then we're going to change division to multiplication, and we're going to flip the second fraction. And when we do that, x plus 3 is going to go to the top. That does not have a GCF or a power of 2, so you can't factor it, so you're going to leave it alone. 2x squared is going to go to the bottom. That's just one term, so you can't do anything with that. So now we're going to list our restriction. And so if I look at the bottom of the first fraction, I will have a -5, a +5, and the bottom of the second fraction, I have an x that's not in a parentheses, so that's 0. And then here's the weird thing with division. Okay, you're not done with your restriction. Okay, and here's the reason why. Because if you go back to the original problem, in the original problem, you have x plus 3 that's on the bottom of the fraction, so you must also include that on your restriction. Even though I know we changed it to multiplication, we flipped it and that went to the top, it was originally on the bottom of the problem, so you have to include that in your restriction. So down here we have to include -3. Okay, so you do have to go back to the original problem and look at the denominator for the fraction that is after the division. So technically, This fraction right here that's after the division, the one that I'm putting a little star next to, that is the only fraction that you will have to list the restriction for both the numerator and the denominator. Because the denominator is in the original problem, so you have to list the restriction for it. And then when you flip it, the numerator becomes the denominator, so you will have to list the restriction for it. So that is the only fraction that you will list both restriction for the top and the bottom. Okay, so now we're gonna go cross things off. So I have an x minus 5 on top and bottom. I have a 2 that I can get rid of diagonally. And I have an x I can get rid of diagonally, which will take this x squared down to just an x. So then on top, we're looking at x plus 3. And then on the bottom, we have a x, and then parentheses x plus 5. And then include your restriction. Okay, one more, and then we're done. Okay, this one has 3 fractions in it. And you'll notice that it does also include a division and a multiplication sign. Okay, and remember the fraction you flip is the one that comes after the division. So the one that comes after the division is our middle one, so that is the only one you will flip. You do not flip the last one because the sign before that one is multiplication. Okay, so this is going to be the only one here in the middle that we are going to flip. All right, so on the first fraction, 3x cubed is just one term, so I'm going to leave that alone. X squared minus 25 is difference of squares, so I'm going to factor that. And I believe we just talked about that a while ago in the last problem, so that's going to go x minus 5, x plus 5. Times, and then we're going to flip this one. So when I flip it, it's going to be x squared plus 6x plus 5 on top, and that can be fast factored because it's a 1x squared. So what multiplies for 5 that adds for 6? And that would be 5 and 1. So x plus 5 and x plus 1. And then 9x squared minus 9x will go to the bottom. That one's missing c. And remember, if you're missing c, that's a GCF. And it looks like you could take out a 9x, which will give me x minus 1 left over. Times, and then the last fraction is x over 6, and x and 6 are each one term, so I can't do anything with that. Okay, so let's list our restriction. Okay, so on the first fraction, you're going to have a positive 5 and a negative 5. And I'm just going to write plus or minus 5. You're more than welcome to list out positive 5, comma, negative 5, or you can write plus or minus 5. The middle fraction on the bottom, I have this x that's on the outside of a parentheses, so that's a 0. And then x minus 1, that will give me a positive 1. The third fraction on the bottom, the 6 doesn't have an x, so I can't write anything for it. And then remember, we did have a division problem, so on the division problem, you will have to go back to the original problem, which happened to be the middle one. So this x squared plus 6x plus 5, I have to also list the restriction for that, which happens to be the top of the middle fraction. So if I look at the top of the middle fraction, I would have a negative 5, which I already have negative 5 listed in my restriction, so I don't have to list it again. And then I would have a negative 1, which I am just going to put plus or minus 1. You're more than welcome to put comma negative 1, but however you want. But remember, if you have division, the fraction that's after division, you have to list the restriction for both the top and the bottom of that fraction. Okay, so now I'm just going to look for things to eliminate. And it looks like I have an x plus 5 that I can eliminate. And then I don't see any other parentheses, so let's look at things that are not in parentheses. I have this middle and the last fraction here. I have this outside x and this outside x. They go away. And then if I look at the first and the middle, I have this 3 and 9. Well, 3 will go into 9 3 times, and that becomes a 1 up on top, which I don't really have to worry about the 1 on top, but I can write it there. And it looks like that's it. So I don't have to worry about the 1. So I have an x to the third, parentheses x plus 1. And then on the bottom, do you notice I have a single 3 and a single 6? Well, instead of putting a single 3 and a single 6 here, let's go ahead and multiply those together because that's the operations I have between the fractions. So 3 times 6 is 18. And then I can list my two parentheses, which is x minus 5 and x minus 1. Put that with your restrictions, and then you are done.